Okay, looks like we're going. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. We're so pleased to be able to bring you tonight's program with Melissa Rachleff Burtt. I've really been looking forward to this one, so it's going to be a great program. I'd like to thank the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library for their support and partnership for these History Revealed programs. We're going on for nearly 5 years now, Peter, so it's been a fantastic group effort. So please consider supporting the Ramsey County Historical Society and the Eastside Freedom Library. We rely on the support of members and friends like you to continue to present these programs and all of our efforts. And there are some great benefits to joining. Ramsey County Historical Society has a wonderful quarterly magazine, Ramsey County History, plus you get a lot of other benefits for being a member. So you can find out more about the membership in RCHS on our website, which is www.rchs.com, including upcoming programs, how to join or donate, these membership benefits, and much more. And please check out the Eastside Freedom Library's website as well. Peter will tell you a little bit more about them in a minute. We have some wonderful programs coming up in January, which will be on both of our websites. So please, again, check that out. And we'll be doing Zoom programs at least through the end of winter. As a reminder, please keep your microphones and personal cameras turned off during the program. You can put your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll read those out loud for Melissa to answer. This program is being recorded, and it will be up on our RCHS and our Eastside Freedom Library YouTube channels very soon. The Ramsey County Historical Society would like to acknowledge the sacred Dakota land. Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of the Dakota and other indigenous peoples. You can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website. Again, that's www.rchs.com. This full statement includes actionable ways in which Ramsey County Historical Society pledges to honor the Dakota and other indigenous peoples of Minnesota Makoche. So we are committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community. And I'm so pleased to bring you tonight's program. But before we turn it over to Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to Peter Rachleff at the Eastside Freedom Library.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. Robin did a great job introducing the Ramsey County Historical Society and the program, but she failed to introduce herself. So that was Robin Priestley of the Ramsey County Historical Society you were hearing from. And again, I'm Peter Rachleff from the Eastside Freedom Library. Just delighted to have my cousin Melissa as our presenter this evening, and delighted that you've all chosen to spend time with us. So the Eastside Freedom Library is now almost 8 years old. Our mission is to inspire solidarity, work for justice, and advocate for equity for all. I do want to invite you to visit our website, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org. There are some great blogs that student interns and others have been writing about our collections, and particularly about the art that we have at the library. Chris Sanders, who is a student from Macalester College, has just written a magnificent blog about Michael Cummings, an African-American male quilter, and his place within the historical tradition of quilting within the African-American community. So visit our website, hit the link for blog, and take a look at Chris's account of Michael Cummings' work. So I have the wonderful responsibility this evening of introducing my cousin Melissa. Melissa is an associate professor in the Visual Arts Administration program at NYU, where she concentrates on the nonprofit sector. In 2017, she curated Inventing Downtown, artist-run galleries in New York City, 1952 to 65, for the NYU Gray Art Gallery. And she wrote and edited the accompanying book or catalog, which is co-published by Gray and Presto Publishing. Melissa began her career as an assistant curator at Exit Art and co-curated exhibitions on the intersections of visual art and documentation. She's also worked on exhibits about underexamined artists, particularly at mid-career. As a program officer for the New York State Council on the Arts from 1999 to 2007, Melissa was an advocate in supporting contemporary art projects done in collaboration with local communities. She's written extensively not only about art and artists, but about artist organizations. I would say that in each of our separate but overlapping spheres, we're advocates for workers' control. And Melissa sees artists as workers and producers struggling to control how their work is both produced and presented to the public. So it's been a particular joy that Melissa has sunk her teeth into the story of a lesser known and unfortunately lesser known artist from the east side of St. Paul, Jean Follett. And it's been great to interact with Melissa around her research and also as she's been making sense of Jean's life and career and the window that it provides us in thinking about the development of the arts and artists in St. Paul. So I'm going to turn things over to Melissa Rachleff Burtt, and she's going to dazzle us with images and stories that will allow us to understand St. Paul in ways that we haven't yet done. Melissa.
Oh, Peter and Robin, thank you both so much for the introduction. And I wanted to say that I am here because of my dear cousin, Peter, and his amazing partner, Beth Cleary. They have both done so much to support my research, and I am really grateful for the support of the Eastside Freedom Library, the most marvelous place, and also the wonderful Ramsey County Historical Society. I want to also say that both Peter and Beth and the Eastside Freedom Library have done so much to broaden my understanding of St. Paul, most especially the East Side. And I want to acknowledge tonight, there are also here with us members of the Follett family, Jean Follett's cousins, Bob Overby and Don Follett. They've been so generous with their time and information about their family and their memories of Jean. And over the years, I've gotten to know Don and his daughter, Chris, and the extraordinary Charlene Follett, Don's wife. And she died this past January. I'll be forever grateful for the conversations I had with Charlene, a psychologist whose insights into Jean Follett gave me so much to consider, and there are many concepts that I'm still processing. Just a reminder that my research is not yet complete, so I'm going to invite everyone to think alongside me, flag areas where I'm unclear or where you want more information. I'm leaving out a lot. And when I'm done with the presentation, I'll be very eager for your thoughts and questions. And secondly, my presentation this evening is in two parts. The first part, I bring together Jean Follett's biography with my research process. I want to throw you into the same deep end that I found myself in as I discovered Follett. And in the second part, I discuss the St. Paul School of Art, today the Minnesota Museum of American Art, which Follett attended in the 1930s. Art history is incorporated throughout, specifically how concepts of modernism place central value on individual self-expression, and how this goal was fundamental to Follett's identity as an artist. I timed the talk, it clocks in at about 35, 38 minutes. So just so you have a sense of where we're headed tonight. So there should be time for questions after. I'm gonna start the slideshow here. Okay. This is an image of Jean Follett in the gallery, the Hansa Gallery, where she would show her, where she showed her work in the 1950s. I first learned about Jean Follett when I was researching the short-lived New York City-based gallery called the Hansa. It was begun by 12 artists in 1952, Follett among them, and it lasted through 1959. The Hansa was notable for showing artists who are independent from trends. During the decade, American artists popularized abstraction or non-figurative painting and sculpture. Respectful of this current, the Hansa artists nonetheless primarily explored forms of representation. And it was at that time, it was called figuration. And you can see an example of a more figurative piece done by Follett, but it tends also towards the abstract. And the Hansa artists built reputations for their pictorial innovations that were a countercurrent to abstraction. Several of the Hansa artists, like Alan Caprow, whose work is here, Robert Whitman, and both of them went on to performance-based and installation-based art. And one artist, Follett's steadfast friend, the artist George Siegel, who became prominent in pop art during the 1960s, all were members of the Hansa Gallery. The Hansa artists took their cue from their teacher, the German emigre Hans Hofmann, whose school in Greenwich Village taught the principles of modern composition, a dynamic system where what you put in one area of a picture impacts other areas. The goal was to create tension throughout the surface, a tension that was always engaged and never resolved. Hofmann's modernist pedagogy became a magnet for two generations of American artists, including Follett. And in the 1950s, the Hansa Gallery was the premier venue to observe the impact of Hofmann's influence. And for me, studying the Hansa artists and exhibitions was an opportunity to rethink the 1950s, apart from the dominant art historical narrative that favored the achievement of American abstract painters. And I just wanted to point out, Hofmann also had a school in Munich until the early 1930s, when the Nazis closed down his school and a lot of the modern art academies. But this artist here is Vaclav Viklisil, and he became very well known in New York City, but his origins are Minneapolis, and he was one of the artists who went to Germany to study with Hofmann. Hansa artists, I was also interested in Jean Follett because she was one of the 3 female artists who founded the Hansa, though more would join in subsequent years. Post-war histories are still largely dominated by the accomplishments of men, yet Follett is referenced in art historical studies, both synchronous with her life and in later revisionist feminist art histories beginning in the 1970s. Follett is there if you look, like a shadowy presence. As I learned more about Follett through reading contemporaneous publications, seeing her surviving work in public collections, and from oral histories given by former Hansa artists who vividly recalled her work, I became convinced that Follett's art was extraordinary. It existed at the far edge of painting, often considered reliefs, where recognizable objects were set in wooden constructions and formed dioramic worlds. Her exhibition history testifies to this difficulty in situating the work. Follett was included in both painting and sculpture shows during the 14 years she lived in New York, from 1946 through 1962. And this is significant because in the 1950s, there were boundaries separating those categories. One had to choose their discipline, either painting or sculpture. Yet Follett's work ambled in the logic of its maker and remained hard to classify. And that is what made it avant-garde or advanced. I think it is fair to say that Follett's artwork during her Hansa Gallery years was generated by the objects she chose. Rather than think of the objects as found, which indicates a randomness to the process, consider each object as carefully selected. I learned Follett purchased many of the objects from industrial hardware stores around Lower Manhattan. Every element spoke to her, suggested compositional possibilities. She told art historian Emmy Donadio in a 1986 interview that, quote, "If an artist can't stay ahead of the time in which they live, they aren't going to be a great artist." And I felt the 1950s was the age of mechanical business. In other words, you have to be like a scientist and explore your environment and take in the whole of the environment. And you'll see this particular work, which is owned by the Museum of Modern Art, several times. I think you saw it in the invitation before, upside down, just because of the way the invitation, well, I spread it out. It's supposed to be folded. And also this lonely piece, but made completely out of found materials and in a kind of painted background. The whereabouts are unknown, and I don't have a color view of it, but you can see the different ways that she's using these found objects, in this case with many-headed creature, in a really playful way, and these textured backgrounds, these bits of wood, these are also bits of different copper tubing of some type, but here we have a much starker use of the materials that she's finding. Synthesizing the world around her is one aspect of Follett's work. There's also a second tendency running through her art, Follett's inner world, memories from her childhood, real and imagined, reactions to experiences. Follett combined seemingly opposite methods, existing objects and emotional acuity commonly associated with abstract expressionism. Follett's artwork has deep textured areas of black or white, an effect she achieved by mixing paint with dirt. Her figures often referenced in triangular shapes, which we'll see again in other images, resonate as alienated beings. So when I learned of the Follett family papers at the Minnesota Historical Society in 2013, I arranged to spend a week going through the 1950s correspondence, restricting myself to the years Follett was involved with the Hansa Gallery. Jean Frances Follett was the second child born to Helen and Sherman Follett in St. Paul on June 5th, 1917. She and her sister Margaret, born in 1915, grew up at 970 Case Street, later Case Avenue, on St. Paul's East Side, where their maternal grandfather, William Crapsey, also lived. Sherman Follett worked for the Postal Service until he retired in the 1950s. His salary was supplemented through rental income from several properties on Case Avenue that Helen managed, properties inherited from her father and her paternal grandfather. The Historical Society acquired the collection in 1992 after the death of Follett's sister, Margaret Baker. The 14 boxes that comprise the archive begins with the 6-year epistolary romance between Helen and Sherman, then extended correspondence between Helen and her daughters during the Second World War, when both Margaret and Jean joined the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, or WACS, and where Jean helped produce WAC News, a weekly paper distributed throughout the armed forces. The collection also includes letters detailing Jean's short, tumultuous marriage to Alan Shirey in 1946. Shirey was an officer in the Canadian Royal Air Force whom she met before the war at the University of Minnesota. The final major series are exchanges between Helen, Margaret, and Jean during her years living in New York from March of 46, when she was discharged from the WACs, until 1962. Also preserved are drafts of letters Jean Follett wrote during a year wrote to friends, as well as letters that she sent to her family from her time in Paris between 1950 and 51, and letters from artist friends throughout her life that she saved until her death from heart failure in July of 1990, a month after her 73rd birthday. The bulk of the correspondence then is really among the Follett family. Oops. In 2013, I anticipated that when I went through the letters Follett sent from New York to her mother and sister in St. Paul during her pivotal years as a member of the Hansa Gallery, I would be treated to great character studies about the gallery artists, internal politics from a female vantage point, the New York art scene, details about her studio process, and maybe, if I'm being honest, a love affair or two. I didn't. Follett's letters in her distinctive hand, and she was left-handed, conveyed financial anxieties, ambitious plans, impractical dreams, and mood swings. And you can see there's a whole bunch of letters where she's always figuring out her monthly expenses and sending that to her family. And if she feels that she's really down to her last dollar, she's, seeing if her mother couldn't just send her $10 or a couple of dollars through the mail. So that's a real major theme. And it's really quite poignant when you start to read through her calculations. And then here's a happier letter where she's talking about reaction she's getting to her 1953 exhibition at the Hansa. Today the Times has called me accomplished, and here's what it says. And she rewrites the review for her mom. In 1949, the name Richard appears for the first time. The sculptor Richard Stankiewicz, with whom Follett would share a studio at 55 Bond Street from 1951 until 1957. Their studio, and you can see Richard drew it, and Jean, this is her writing, she put in where her easel was, and this is Richard's area of the studio, and they have a kitchen area and some living quarters in the building. It was a former storage space that they got. Anyway, sorry. Their studio on Bond Street was adjacent to the infamous Bowery, a rundown area, not anymore, but then a rundown area for cheap bars that were open all night. Stankiewicz was essential to Follett's career during the 1950s as a companion and studio partner. They shared a sensibility about incorporating existing materials. However, Stankiewicz's work of this era was far more playful than Follett's. Stankiewicz, like Follett, joined the Hansa, where his exhibitions garnered critical enthusiasm. He was one of the few artists whose work would regularly sell. Follett had 4 solo exhibitions at the Hansa, which also received attention, but her reviews were more mixed in comparison to Stankiewicz. Follett also insisted that the price of her work match his, and this led to comments about her price inflation, Follett's unrealistic expectations, a persistent theme in oral testimonies, especially because her work did not sell. In 1958, Stankiewicz joined a commercial gallery where his career advanced further with support from dealers, museum curators, and collectors. In the spring of 1959, Follett and Stankiewicz ended their relationship, and in May, the Hansa artist decided to close the gallery. Follett was invited to show with Leo Castelli, then a very new gallery, located in the dealer's home on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She participated in one group show in the fall of 1959, but left Castelli for the newly formed Green Gallery on 57th Street, the center of New York's gallery system. After the first season, the Green Gallery switched focus to emerging pop artists and new geometric sculpture or minimal art. Follett's work didn't fit the new direction, and she was phased out of the exhibition program despite the gallery director's affinity for her work. In 1965, the Green Gallery closed, ending Follett's commercial gallery career. I just want to point out, this is an exhibition at the Hansa Gallery, and this, and there was some staining on the photograph, but this is a sculpture, wire sculpture by Stankiewicz, and next to it are Follett's drawings. And so there's this real conversation going on in their work. And you will see this drawing is now owned by the Walker Art Center. I don't know the whereabouts of the others. I finished my book and exhibition project on the Hansa and a dozen other artist-run galleries in 2017, titled Inventing Downtown, and as best I could, including Follett's perspective about the Hansa, and importantly, reintroduce some of her artwork. This is a bit damaged, but it's a piece I found in Athens, Greece. I actually traveled to Greece to see it, to try to determine, you know, if it's survived. And I thought there are a few things missing, but it was still a very powerful piece called Three Black Bottles. There's, I think, only 2 black bottles left in it. And then this is that wonderful piece that MoMA owns that we got in the show. And this is the Hansa Gallery section. This is another George Siegel, and all around this is a woman artist who painted this portrait, Jane Wilson, and the artist, just skipping on her name. It will come back to me. I'm sorry, but there are a few female artists in the Hansa group. Oops, I should go back because I want to finish here. My next step was to work on a monographic exhibition to bring Follett's full achievement to broad attention. There was only one problem. Even though Follett died in 1990, not that long ago, very few artworks survived. What happened to her art is a tragedy. In February 1962, a fire in a building adjacent to her Bond Street studio caused extensive damage to the building, making it unfit for occupancy. In the immediate aftermath, Follett saved about a dozen pieces, but their whereabouts remain a mystery that I'm still untangling. It is also uncertain how much artwork she made when she returned to her parents' home that February in 1962, or later at a home she shared with her sister and nephew on English Street near Lake Phelan. Follett always intended to return to New York permanently, and I suspect that is why she never had an active studio practice in St. Paul. In 1972, Follett rented an apartment in the newly established West Beth Artist Subsidized Housing Complex in Greenwich Village, but after a short stay, Follett let the unit languish, relinquishing it in 1973. After that experience, she never lived or worked in New York again. A partial photographic record of Follett's artwork is preserved thanks to the Twin Cities-focused art collection by my heroes Charlie Gallup and Matt Murphy. I also located a different set of documentary photographs in an archival collection at the Museum of Modern Art. In other words, fragments of Follett's achievement exist and can be dated, but not enough actual work nor documentation from the totality of her output survives, making a monographic study unfeasible. It bears reminding that Follett lived in an era when it was nearly impossible for women to have a career as an avant-garde artist, making the loss especially tragic. Yet I still believe Follett deserved greater attention, but I had to shift the framework away from artwork as the center of the project and instead approach Follett as the protagonist in a broader social art history. After 2 study grants from New York University, which brought me to St. Paul several times in 2018 and 2019, I determined the way to tell the story was through an examination of American modernism. What was American modernism? And that was, this is really hard to answer, so I'm still working on this. It was not any single style. The term is rather bloated, encompassing several generations of artists, architects, and designers. There's a variety of approaches and principles, but common to all is an abiding commitment to individual self-expression. And because of this, modern art incorporates both representational and abstracted approaches. Early 20th century literature, such as the examples here by Catherine Dreier and Sheldon Chaney, stress making is in part having the artist make their spirit visible. And this idea of art as having a spirit is a concept that was popularized by Vasily Kandinsky in his 1911 book, The Spiritual in Art. And this is a Kandinsky book design cover. Now, modernist histories and theories also shifted how art was taught. Ambitious new schools were founded in Europe, most famously the Bauhaus in Germany, and in the United States, Black Mountain College in North Carolina, where one of the Bauhaus artists, Joseph Albers, when he got out of Germany, founded the art department there. The curriculum emphasized compositional principles and personal expression over the adherence to notions of beauty. Beauty was recast as decorative, and I think you can tell from the streamlined buildings here that there's not a lot of adornment. Everything is pretty geometric and graphic, and a real economy of means with the materials. Now, modern art pedagogy was alive in the Twin Cities, and it was fostered in 2 art schools. The Minneapolis Society of Fine Arts, later the Minneapolis School of Art, which began in 1886. And in St. Paul, its art school began first as an association of women in 1890. And the association transformed around 1903, becoming the St. Paul School of Art, when Minnesota-born and New York-trained artist designer Elizabeth Bonta was hired to act as principal and also teach. There was a cordial relationship between both schools. However, they differed in pedagogy. Where the Minneapolis Art School would formalize into a degree-granting college, today the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, the St. Paul School of Art followed the academy model, borrowed from Paris, and did not offer degrees. Students remained until they acquired the direction needed to work on their own. And this brings us to the second part of the talk, the influence of the St. Paul School of Art, which from 1910 through the spring of 1918 was part of the progressive era civic improvement organization called the St. Paul Institute, which survives today as the Science Museum of Minnesota. After the First World War, the St. Paul School reconstituted apart from the Institute as an independent modern art academy and gallery, whose legacy is the Minnesota Museum of American Art today. Art training and an ambitious exhibition program distinguished the St. Paul School of Art as unabashedly modernist during the Depression, an era best known for federally supported art programs and social realism. The school actually almost closed forever at the onset of America's entry into World War I in April 1917. Enrollment cratered, and the St. Paul Institute, which had saved the school in 1910 by bringing it under its auspices, had to withdraw its support. Former students resolved not to let the art school perish, and they reorganized under the name the Art League, then the Art Students League of St. Paul, and in 1924, reconstituted for a third time as the St. Paul School of Art in a room they rented in the Court Block downtown. In 1927, presumably with an increase in students, the school moved to a larger space on the third floor of the Essex Building at 23 East 6th Street, with wealthy patrons serving on a board of overseers, including Mrs. C.R. Noyes, wife of the wholesale drug firm whose first name I've not yet located, and Arlene Griggs. They hired the celebrated painter Dewey Albinson as director. And Albinson, whose work you see here, had just returned to St. Paul after a year in Paris, where he studied Cubist compositional theories at a school begun by the artist André Lhote. And Albison's subjects at the time incorporated scenic views from northern Minnesota. And if you attended the talk on Hazel Belvo, you also saw a lot of Albinson's work from northern Minnesota, just beautiful scenes of nature. The course brochure under Albinson, and here's the course brochure when he was the director, proclaimed, "No city is complete which does not provide for its citizens some place where they can go to enjoy works of art and painting and sculpture." The school's board formed a committee, all women, who began an exhibition program. In addition to organizing exhibits of student and faculty artwork, they also organized exhibitions of renowned modern artists in America and Europe. Partnering with the Central Public Library, which had a gallery space on the fourth floor, and collaborating with commercial galleries in Chicago and New York, the committee organized several exhibitions a year. In this way, the brochure noted, the students and public will not only be able to see some of the best work of contemporaneous artists of America and Europe, but they will also have the opportunity of becoming familiar with the art of the past. And a key partner in the exhibition program was the librarian and later library director, Perry Jones, who also joined the school board in 1931. And I'm working now with the library. They're helping me remotely to try to uncover more of the collaboration between the school and library. I'd like to give a snapshot of the exhibition program during the school's first decade as an independent academy. In 1928, the school was the first in Minnesota to exhibit artists Matisse, Duran, and other Fauvists, and also the first to present Cubist works by Picasso and Braque. The following year, a retrospective exhibit of Modigliani on the 10-year anniversary of his death came to the school from Chicago, and it was called The School's Glory by St. Paul's art critic James Gray. He advised readers it was, quote, an extraordinary privilege to have so intimate a glimpse of the artwork of an artist whose contribution to modernism has been so tremendous. During the Depression, gallery staff and board worked with gallerist Catherine Koo, later the director of the Art Institute of Chicago's museum, on a Corbusier painting exhibition. In that same year, 1936, arranged with the Los Angeles dealer, Howard Putzel, to host an exhibition of the surrealist painter Yves Tanguy, which was coordinated in part with help from Marcel Duchamp, who sent paintings to the school from Paris, but he, quote, forgot to list them in his correspondence. They also worked with Joseph Albers at Black Mountain College in 1937 and 38 on an exhibition of his paintings touring the Midwest. And the exhibition committee also partnered with the Museum of Modern Art in its touring programs, notably working with Iris Berry, MoMA's very first film curator, to start a film society in St. Paul in 1937, which focused on innovations in early cinema. Follett, an avid moviegoer, participated in the school's film society. Students could attend for free, and told Emmy Donadio that they were really important for her development. The lively exhibition program made the school influential beyond St. Paul because it cultivated local relationships and formed partnerships with dealers and museums across the country. And you can also see, here's an example of a gallery show where they created a checklist of a number European artists modern artists that they're showing. And here is a show that they brought in of Hans Hofmann's work in 1931. We'll hear a little bit more about Hofmann again. The St. Paul School of Art, along with the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, participated in a national network of organizations and galleries supportive of modern art, a network that New York's Museum of Modern Art, which was founded in 1929, would formalize through its touring programs. The Modern Art Network during the Depression has not garnered nearly as much attention as the federally sponsored national arts programs. Art during the Depression is still discussed in terms of regionalism, or geographic regions from which federal programs were instigated, a system that privileged New York as independent from any region whatsoever, and also which received the most money. The thrust of the federal programs was to place value in local scenes and mine America's sites and history, what was termed the usable past, to create a relatable pictorial experience. In contrast, the Modern Art Network placed modernist affinity as the core value, and this sensibility dominated over place. The modern artist did not look to the past. Their concerns were with the spirit, the composition, conceptualizing the future. And I thought that this catalog cover from 1933, where the museum actually invited artists from across America to exhibit, but this is exactly the network. And we don't have St. Paul, we need St. Paul here, but this is exactly the network that the St. Paul School of Art was working with, with the galleries in Los Angeles. They also toured some of their shows to San Francisco. Seattle is extremely important as well. There was a lot of interchange that way, less so in the South, except for Black Mountain College, but also in the cities here along the East Coast. In the spring of 1929, Albinson resigned his directorship. The artist hired to succeed him died unexpectedly, so the board turned to painter Cameron Booth, an artist and instructor at the Minneapolis School of Art, who knew Albinson, had also studied in Paris with Lahaut, and significantly in Munich with Hans Hofmann in the years after World War I. Booth brought a more vigorous approach to modernism and reinvigorated the school's mission around advanced principles, which captured the imagination of a new generation of students, including Follett. And this is an example of Booth's work during the 1930s, which were local scenes, but you can see the influence of the kind of bright colors that are, not what you would see in reality, but very much in keeping with the work that was being done in Paris with the Fauves, these sharp colors being offered, but still, interested in local scenes, but not representing them, faithfully in terms of a realistic, quote unquote, color formation. And here's a wonderful picture of him at the school working on a painting or maybe helping a student with a project. In the fall of 1930, Booth revamped the brochure, proclaiming on the verso that as forward-looking citizens, we must encourage our young talents. And describing the school's new aims and policy, Booth wrote, they were, quote, one of the few art schools in the Northwest which teaches in the modern manner and is frankly interested in the modern movement. It found that students of originality and talent are growing more and more dissatisfied with old academic training. They are finding new inspiration in the freer methods of modern teaching. Well, what was this freer method? Booth defined it as, quote, a progressive and forward-looking institute. It provides studios where students can work under exceptional artists. Instruction is personal and individual, and there are no set courses. Each student progresses at his own pace and is given new work according to his need and ability. The atmosphere is that of a studio rather than a school. The language of the time is gendered male, but the point here is that there's this real focus on individual development, and it's really hammered in the mission statement of the school. And the brochure is a lot less photographically based. There's a lot of graphic design in these early brochures. And these are some students who studied with Booth. Seong Moy, and this is a lithograph he did in 1940 of some of the buildings that were being torn down as part of civic improvement projects. And a really interesting artist who's also starting to get attention again. He had a lot of attention early in his career. Jerome Kamrowski, he taught for many years in Detroit, and he was for a while, both of them were close friends with Jean Follett. And this is a piece in Embalmed Universe, a shadow box collage, which is actually currently on view right now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in a surrealism show. Booth defined modern art for prospective and current students as the necessity of personal expression in painting and sculpture, as opposed to the mere imitation of the surface appearance of things. This change, that personal expression is what's the important quality. This change generated local press coverage, and one newspaper proclaimed that under Booth, and this was the headline, "Standardized instruction systems are gone." And the credo, quote, "begins and ends with feeling," a concept credited to Hoffman. And in another interview with the local press, Booth defined modernism further, stating, quote, "The effort in the modern school is to teach the student to look upon his material with his own eye and to record the masses of form and of color as he individually sees them. Education in art, like education in all other fields, is seeking to develop persons of talent who have new ideas to express. It is not content merely with giving them an unpliable technique made of hard and fast rules." Booth created impetus for other artist teachers in St. Paul, including Sister Maria Teresa at St. Catherine's College and Caroline Gilbert at Mechanics High School, who also studied with Hoffman. They did so in summer sessions in Berkeley, to also change their curriculums at their schools to align with Hoffman's methods. And that generated a lot of press, particularly the high school switch. In May of 1930, Booth arranged for Hoffman, who was on his way to teach his first American summer session in Berkeley, to speak at the St. Paul School of Art. Later that fall, Hoffman told a reporter for the National Art Digest that in addition to Berkeley, the little-known St. Paul School of Art, together with the University of Minnesota, where Booth also taught, constitutes one of the two cultural centers in the United States. Significantly, Hoffman left out New York. Even as the Depression worsened and the schools, the school's board decided to expand. And in 1933, moved the school from downtown to Cathedral Hill into a former photography studio at 341 Selby Avenue. The school now occupied an entire building, and as such had more room for classes and an area for exhibitions. They would still use the library's gallery for larger shows. The expansion did not immediately translate into new students, rendering the finances precarious, which can be charted by the course brochures, each becoming more modest in design and scale. In 1934, Booth toned down his muscular modernist rhetoric in favor of an appeal to budding art lovers, defending the expense of the art school as necessity. "There is no easy way except by going to art school," Booth advised. But in the fall of 1935, the school regained its financial footing, likely due to donations from an influx of new board members. The school increased the number of courses, hired new artists, including abstract painter Leroy Turner, who taught composition and design. They also lowered the tuition. The changes attracted 75 students that year. And also, the same year, the board began a newsletter to publicize the school's exhibitions and to start a membership program, as well as host biannual fundraisers and other public activities. They also began a new experiment, an art lending library done in collaboration with the Central Public Library. The goal was to build a stronger base of support for modern art, to get St. Paul residents to desire modern paintings in their homes, at least on a temporary basis. A $5 fee paid to the school enabled residents to borrow artwork in a collection designated for that purpose, artwork donated by local artists. The system was identical to borrowing a book. The art lending program would expand to fine art prints, adding European modernists, and students in the school were also encouraged to participate. In May of 1936, Follett was notified that she was selected for one of the school's few scholarships, and she began full-time that fall. Significantly, Follett's art training coincided with a major exhibition and book written by Alfred Barr, the director of the Museum of Modern Art, titled Cubism and Abstract Art. The exhibition traveled to the Minneapolis Institute of Art in December of 1936, and both the exhibit and catalog were assigned to all students. Historically, the impact of Cubism and abstract art was tremendous. Barr's project shifted modernism's center of gravity, so to speak, away from post-impressionism, replacing artist Paul Cézanne as the central genius from which all modern art derived, with Pablo Picasso at the center. Cubism, not impressionism, as the title suggests, was modern art's significant breakthrough. Follett's diary mentions chapters she read from the book, and the surviving sketchbook from Follett's first year includes a notation that, quote, "The meeting between representation and abstract means the most to Mr. Booth." And you might say that this meeting of representation and abstract is also, the very heart of Cubism. And we're looking at the green still life of Picasso, an artwork that was in that show that traveled and is owned by the Museum of Modern Art. It is something that we can see that Follett, and we don't know the date of this, but I believe it was done when she was in art school, is also taking some of the dots that she notices Picasso incorporating in his still life, and incorporating some of that, into her gouache work on paper. The other thing I will say is that throughout Follett's life, because I've been to other archives of her artist friends, people she would have corresponded with, to sort of read what she wrote to her friends, not just her family, but her friends. And she often is purchasing, the Museum of Modern Art, produced this artwork as a note card, and Follett throughout the 70s and 80s is using this card. So this painting was extremely important to her, and I've been studying this painting for a long time. We can, this is not art history, but we can talk about it at any point. It's related to a lot of other work he was doing then as well. Mining this single surviving notebook from 1936 that's in the collection of Charlie Gallup and Matt Murphy, it yields assignments that she would not note down, presented as compositional problems, such as this one on the left. She writes, mostly gray, each large area of gray different in value and color, some vertical, some horizontal, some diagonal, large or intermediate, brighter colors of gray for small areas. Few are very dark. Last thing to consider will be texture. It was for the student to work out from such instructions how all the requirements would come together to form a compelling picture. And this was also in her sketchbook. And I wonder if she's at this point starting to also kind of simplify what she's seeing. This could be a nature scene, but piles of wood, and later she's going to be using wood, not canvas, as her main material for her artwork. And these are amazing photographs that are in the collection of the Minnesota Museum of American Art, and they so kindly let me visit right before COVID in February of 2019, and let me just go through what survives from these years. And it was like a miracle. We found a whole series of photographs, probably around the time the school moved to Summit Avenue, and photograph students working for promotional purposes. And Follett was right there. And this is Jean Follett here working on a drawing. And here she is again, the only woman in her beautiful white shirt, really standing out in this beautiful photograph. So Follett relished these challenges from Booth and especially Leroy Turner. She gave an account of Turner to Emmy Donadio. Turner had asked students to study what happens after placing 2 or 3 dots on a page, how even a few marks created a composition. Follett told Donadio, what you have to do is calculate, how does that dot work within the shape of the paper and in relation to that other dot? And what do they say to one another? And then if you put another dot, you had to relate it to the other 2. Then you were having a tougher challenge. And you go on and on like that. And that's how you build something. Follett had a natural affinity for this type of compositional challenge. She excelled in Turner's course. 50 years later, she still marveled at the impact of his assignments. She told Emmy Donadio, Leroy Turner was responsible for me realizing that was a quality I should preserve. And it came from Europe, from him to me. By way of closing, I will end with the spring of 1946 and through 48, you'll see, when Follett and Booth are both in New York. Booth was teaching at the Art Students League and had begun working abstractly, while Follett was studying with Hoffman in Greenwich Village on the GI Bill, working in charcoal. And this is the building where the Hoffman School was. I believe it was on this top floor, but I don't have that verified. And the Village Barn was some business that was on the ground floor. And this is one of the charcoal drawings that she became really known for among her artist friends. They all loved the drawings that she was doing in class. So whereas everyone was drawing the model, Follett began not drawing the model realistically, but really thinking of the model in terms of shape, proportion, and what to do with the page. And this is actually, I believe, now at the Whitney Museum, part of their collection. In charcoal, in this medium, Follett reconnected with her interest in shape and form and lessons she drew from her avid study of Picasso, whose work she would see frequently at MoMA. And this is another artwork that was in the Cubism show that really makes me think of Follett's work. She doesn't talk about this, but I look at the triangles and the way he's really, you know, abstracting his studio space and his reality into these more pictogram images. Of course, he's using color, but he's not a big colorist. Like when you think of Matisse or the Fauves, and Follett, we'll see really is really working a lot with black and white predominantly, very little color in her work. Follett also visited galleries showing European artists who had fled Europe during the war, many of whom were still in New York and active in surrealism. And this led to yet another shift in American modernism that Follett absorbed. Reflecting on New York in the 1940s, the New York painter Peter Busa told an interviewer that contact with European artists meant American artists were, quote, breaking down the barriers between art and life. This feeling freed our sense of scale. The surrealists' idea was that we have a rich world within and we don't have to look for it outside ourselves. It was an idea that combined ultimately the brilliance of the mind with the enthusiasm of the act. And this, even though Follett didn't say this, but this to me really seemed to be infusing her process and what she was making in New York. And here is this photograph of her second studio in New York when she was subletting from the artist couple, Balcom and Gertrude Green. Balcom taught at Cranbrook Academy, and so she was able to use his studio for the months when he was in Michigan. And you can just see this incredible output of the kind of work that she's doing and really starting to build up the surfaces with this heavy use of paint. I'm not sure if these were her canvases either. And of course, we don't know what happened to most of this work. So Follett too left behind literal observations. Line, texture, and form were her subjects. In 1948, she began a series, which we were just looking at, where she used paint straight from the tube to create abstracted shapes that could be read as personages, in effect drawing with the paint. In March of that year, Cameron Booth visited Follett in her first, not the one we just saw, but an earlier studio on the Lower East Side. He must have admired her drawings and paintings because later that same month, Follett visited his studio and was surprised to discover what Booth produced. She wrote to her mother that his, quote, 2 new paintings are after my way of doing things. And he said, you know, you're right. You're way ahead of all of us about this economy of means you're working on. Booth said, you're true to yourself alone, and your forms are entirely your own and come out of your medium. It appears the student surpassed the teacher. She closed her letter with this thought: I guess I'd better hurry and have a show when I find people cashing in on my ideas like this. Yet, as I would discover in her letters at the Minnesota Historical Society, Follett was not able to show this work, while Booth's abstract work was exhibited widely. Follett's fight for recognition mirrors many artists, particularly women, whose efforts were never fully embraced by the commercial gallery and museum system. Although I cannot change the past, I can, in my own way, bring Follett's history and achievement to light. Follett absorbed the innovation at the heart of modernism, and in keeping true to its core philosophies, constructed a body of modernist work all her own. Thank you.
So we want to encourage you to type questions into the chat. I wonder, Carla, are you able to unmute individuals?
Yes, can do that.
I wonder, Robert Overby has typed such interesting comments into the chat, and I would rather that Robert read them if he's willing to, rather than have me read them. Robert, would you like to unmute and share your comments with us? Please.
Oh, I believe the first comment was that I met Jean in the early 1970s. My father and I went over to her house in Margaret on English Street. It was the first and only time I met her. I used to go to their house in the late 1950s on K Street, but I don't remember meeting her or Margaret that much at that time. My older sister does remember talking to her and was very impressed with her. The other comment was that I went to the house when I was contacted by conservators who were caring for Margaret and finding a nursing home for her to live in when she was unable to be at the house by herself. her son Bill had died previously, so she was there by herself. And I was allowed to rummage through a few things in the house, but I should say that the Minnesota Historical Society had the first look through everything before any of the relatives came to the house, which I didn't appreciate it at the time. But I'm happy that all the letters and things were preserved. They also preserved a whole collection of toys from the 1920s, I believe, that the children played with. So in the basement of the house on English Street, there was a kiln, a pottery kiln. I thought that was impressive.
Yeah, that was Margaret's. She took a lot of pottery classes starting after the war. She took classes in ceramics at the St. Paul School of Art.
Okay.
And they have some of her ceramics in the collection of the Minnesota Historical Society.
The other point that I wrote related to Jean and Margaret is that somewhere in my boxes of things, I have, I believe, the original blueprints that they developed for construction of the house. And at that time when it was built, it was a long triangular narrow lot, and it was adjacent to the old Northern Pacific Railroad line nearby. So it wasn't the most desirable property. Maybe they got a good price for it, but they made the house fit there, and I was happy to be able to see it twice.
Yeah, and Margaret, in the archive, there's a whole file of Margaret's house designs, which she began doing when she was in high school, and it's really interesting. You know, she's really thinking about what would be the ideal way to live. There was also a really interesting show at the St. Paul School of Art when Jean was attending, maybe her first or second year, that brought together 4 different architects and new ideas of house design. And one was Frank Lloyd Wright. And the exhibit itself was that you had to, each architect sent a kit, and they would get all the students together to try to put it together. And I think Margaret was just fascinated by that show.
I always suspected that some of Frank Lloyd Wright's design elements are part of the house, but I'm not an expert in that, so I don't know. And the other surprising thing is I knew nothing about Margaret's drawing abilities with blueprints, because all I knew is her whole career was working at the Minnesota Department of Revenue.
So the house is still standing, right, Melissa?
Yes, we do these drive-bys. Yes.
And remind us what number on English?
15. Oh dear. Wait.
It's about halfway between Maryland and Larpenteur on the east side of the street. It's a distinctive architecture. You can't miss it.
Yeah, it has that lovely balcony.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find it.
The other fun thing, if I could quickly mention, when I used to go to Jean's house and visit her parents, the impressive thing for me was out in the yard. Her father, Sherman, had built walls with fieldstone, and he built a bird bath, he built the fireplace, he built benches. The whole yard had these things throughout, and I always wanted to learn how to do that. And I've done some cement work, but I'm no professional.
Yeah, I snuck my camera, Bob, and took some pictures. I'll email them to you of what survives in those properties from what Sherman made.
Is Don Follett registered?
Don has raised his hand.
I just want to leave with a few remarks. I've had a chance to meet and talk and be with Melissa for a couple of times here, and I just want to say what a wonderful person she is, and I'm really impressed with her sense of authenticity and research, and I know she'll do a great job. My comment, Jean was quite a bit older than I was, roughly 20 years or maybe 18, something like that. So I wasn't about to have any talks professionally with her, but what I did notice about her compared to the rest of the family, she was quite quiet and kind of maybe even mystical. That might be too heavy a word, but very much unlike Margaret. I'm sure Bob would agree. Margaret was quite abrupt, quite organized, quite, what should I say? Did I say that? Abrupt?
She tended to dominate conversations.
Probably. Within the Follett household there, Jean's parents, they acquired both Life magazine and National Geographic, and they were stacked to the ceiling almost. And I wonder how much, of course, I never had a chance to ask Jean how much either of those two publications might have influenced her. Of course, Life had just started to come out in the late 30s, and a picture magazine, of course, and is now long gone. But I wouldn't doubt that had something to do with her, artistic dreams, let's say.
That's such a great point. I would also say that, her grandfather who lived with them was, he made them a lot of toys. I haven't seen the toys yet. I really want to see those toys because she would draw pictures and then he would make something from the toys. So he would do a lot of drawing with them. And as we talked about, Sherman himself, was really, he could just do these amazing, more functional sculptures, but, in the backyard. So, and her mother, when Nell was in high school, she was really, really good at, realistic drawing. In fact, when Jean would show her the artwork that she was making, her mother would write, well, couldn't you make something pretty, something like that. And that would, of course, send Jean into, bales of frustration. And so I think that was some of the reason why she didn't really talk so much about her art with them, because she said at one point she wasn't sure they would understand. There are a couple of questions about the school, which
Sure.
I could field here. And also, so one is on that collaboration between this is from Claire.
Comment was, I'm very interested in the collaboration between the St. Paul Art School and the public library. Back around 2002, I was researching the public library history as they were preparing for their big renovation of Central. And at that time, I know there was giant dumpster units outside the back of Central Library, and they were throwing out stuff they couldn't keep anymore. And some of that was art prints by people like Charles Beck, which I didn't really appreciate at the time, but they're throwing out old furniture and all kinds of stuff. So the art rental loan program that you mentioned that the art school did, were they working, collaborating with the public library on that? Was that like a sort of a joint venture, or were they?
It was.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think that they use the library staff to monitor, to like handle like who checked out what. So and that all happened when Perry Jones was the director. There, another colleague of mine, the Museum of Modern Art also started an art lending service, although it turned into something very hoity-toity. But when that's a fancy people. But there was this, she told me that I should look into a man named Walter Barice, because it was his idea of trying to popularize modern art through lending it, like the way you would lend a book. So, but I will say that the librarians, Morgan, and I'm just slipping on her last name, she is trying to go through the files, but one of the things she found out is that the administrative offices is where the gallery space was, which is on the 4th floor. And I found that really interesting, also because I would have thought the exhibition space would be on the ground floor, but it was on the 4th floor of the library.
Beth, you've raised your hand. Do you want to Can you unmute?
It didn't work, but now it does. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, Melissa, for this really inspiring and substantial walk through your own process, certainly of of what happens in research when you hope that you're going to uncover a trove of lost artworks and a life story and all sorts of things that the world is not even knowing we need. And yet you can't, it turns out. And so to broaden and shift how to talk about Jean without giving up on her, because she didn't produce for you, she or the world, these material objects that would allow you to tell, a delightful story, is such a tribute to your, I will say, among other things, feminist sensibility. Like, oh, of course, her difficult, large, and what do you do with these things, pieces are lost to the world potentially. So, I mean, it's such a service that she's actually staying as part of a bigger story. And I guess where I'm getting with this preamble is my interest in, and they're so tantalizing, the images you have shown of the work that retains, and some of the work that we were able to glimpse there from the 50s. And it strikes me that the 1950s is such a vexed and wonderful and vexed time to speak to the world through materials. I mean, you mentioned, did she say this, that she thought of the 50s as a kind of industrial decade or mechanical? Either of those words maybe, or another one. And I guess I wonder if, given how closely you're correlating the ways that she looked at Picasso's work and then spoke to him through her brushstrokes or dots or whatever, and you are reading things so closely, is there a way that you read any of her work in relation to commentary about her times, response to the bomb, response to what the world was trying to wake up from, the nightmare of the genocide? And I mean, I just want to I don't want to make a story either, but I'm wondering, given how carefully you're looking at everything, like what's coming up for you in terms of her.
This whole section of the talk I had to take out. That was kind of going a little bit into that area, Beth. It's so interesting. So the other thing about Jean, her mother and sister, less so Sherman, I'm not sure he participated, is that they joined the Unity Church, the Unitarian Church in St. Paul, and they the ideals, the progressive, liberal, humanist ideals ran very deep with Follett, and she read the news, she listened to the news, she was just avidly paying attention. And so there are points in her letters where she's agonizing about the kind of conservative turn under Eisenhower, how some of her artist friends are Republicans and she doesn't really feel comfortable around them anymore because it really goes against her way of seeing things. And I do feel, but I haven't done the analysis yet, but I do feel that some of the pieces are referencing these, as I kind of think about the incidents that are going on in her life that she's noting, and again, it's to her mother and sister. It's maybe different, what she would tell her friends, but as I'm like looking at that, I'm also looking for clues in the art. And I do really find that her Unitarian beliefs are such a constant thread, and that's going to be a really important part of the book to also clarify the importance of that church and the teachings of that church, in her life.
Great. I know Bruce Pomerantz was trying to get in. Are you unmuted now, Bruce? And Can you
Yes.
speak, please?
But I think Melissa kind of answered my question, because my question was, what was her mindset back in those days, and did it influence the dark colors? And I think Melissa just said answers that question, and the answer is yes.
Thank you.
I should also say she did also suffer like from these ups and downs in terms of she wanted, there were certain romances. I did find out about certain romances that didn't work out, and these of course cast a shadow over her spirit, and and I think that the split with Richard Stankiewicz was, it came at a terrible time. It really shattered her in a very profound way, because she was really tracking her career comparatively to his at the same time. But anyway, so I think that we can't lay it all on. I mean, there is this personal life, but at the same time, she's very much a participant in and aware of the world around her. I think Bob's.
Yeah, Bob, back, please.
Yes, I had a couple comments. I don't, for what it's worth, Jean's father, Sherman, his sister, my grandmother, she studied theosophy. And I don't know if the two branches of the family talked about such things, but my own father's family studied art and literature and all those kind of things in the teens and 20s of the last century. The other thing I want to note for people, many years ago, I looked up Jean Follett on the internet, and she's listed in the who's who of American artists, and she's considered a pioneer of abstract expressionism. And it's either from that text or from Melissa's comments that I discovered she had studied in Italy during or after World War II with the abstract expressionist artists over there, and brought that knowledge back as well.
She actually, that's a mistake. I don't know where they got that from, but she actually she never went to Italy, but she did go to Paris. Yeah, she was supposed to actually go around with a friend who was going to bring her, but she had a falling out. That friend's a little politically conservative, and they did have a fight. And so anyway, she decided not to go around. So she stayed in Paris. She was at the Grand Chaumier at studying there, and also Léger's school.
So we have time maybe for one more. Anyone else want to unmute and speak?
I just also wanted to acknowledge Morgan Strickland was the librarian who's been so helpful to me, and she is here tonight. And Morgan, thank you so much for the information you were able to find for me. And I can't wait to get to St. Paul and learn more. And my doppelganger asked another question earlier. My friend Julie. She, by the way, Julie interviewed many artists who knew Jean, and a lot of the interviews that I listened to back in 2012, 2013, these are the people who are, when they're reflecting back on the 50s, they are remembering Jean Follett, whatever happened to her. Oh my God, her work was so incredible. But Julie wanted to know more about how the St. Paul School of Art's pedagogy fit into other schools. And I don't know that I can generalize yet because I'm still learning about it. It certainly was different from the Black Mountain College. I've actually borrowed Julie's book on Black Mountain College. But Black Mountain College really had classes, and many of the other schools really had classes. I could just say this really quickly. There were 3 ways to get art education, I think then and now. One is university, college or university degrees. And so those people who go there usually have to take liberal arts classes or science classes in addition to your art classes. So that's one approach, the well-rounded. The other approach starts during the progressive era, and this is the formation of all these institutes, these kind of Americanization institutes that try to get everybody, to be industrious and kind of prepare you for new industries, particularly illustration, graphic design, et cetera, and try to really improve and make cities more beautiful and more tasteful. And so the St. Paul School of Art, when it was with the Institute, really aligned with those values. And the school in Minneapolis also kind of had an affiliation with the Minneapolis Institute of the Arts, which was also part of this institute movement. The Chicago Institute. I mean, there's millions of institutes. So that's another path, but there is just an art curriculum and you get a degree in either the commercial art, teaching art, like pedagogy art, or you get a degree in as a fine artist. And then the last model is the one borrowed from France, which aligns with, I suppose the St. Paul School of Art was most closely aligned with the Art Students League in New York, which is that you just go until you're like, I'm done, I'm an artist, I don't need to be in school anymore, which Jean actually went to school for a really long time, but that was in part due to the GI Bill, which allowed her to, get a stipend at the same time she was studying with Hoffman. But many people in academies could, on average go for 1 year, or they can go for 4, 8, they stop when they feel they're ready, and there's no degree.
Bob?
Just quickly,
yes.
Melissa, did you tell me that Jean had a daytime job where she was kind of a draftsperson in New York City?
She did.
D-R-A-F-T.
Yes, and in fact, with dear Julie Martin, whose husband, Billy Kluver, worked for Bell Labs in New Jersey, we went to the Bell Labs campus where we looked up, because Julie knows the archivist there, we found the employee directory, because Bell Labs is huge. And we found Jean Follett, because I knew she worked at Bell Labs, but we found out the dates she worked there from March of, I think, 52 until 54. And she helped put out one of the magazines, as well as did mechanical drawings of some of the different inventions being done at Bell Labs. So I'm going to be going back there and looking through these really complicated electrical engineering manuals to see if I can't tell which are Jean's drawings.
Great.
So that's probably more than you wanted to know.
And Don?
Yeah, just a comment. My recollection is, of course, I was younger than Jean's family and Jean herself, but it seems among the family there wasn't wide support of her. I suppose it's always the fate of the beginning artist is seen perhaps as tilting windmills or whatever. And it's so great now that she'll receive some recognition. And I hope she's up there someplace saying, I told you guys.
I hope so. I mean, it's hard. She was doing very avant-garde work. And I just want to mention also in Bob's comments, he mentions Marian Overby, a very important artist in her own right. And Bob's, I'm not sure, Bob, if that's your cousin, but she went to work for the design firm in California, the first Bentwood chairs. Oh, what are they?
Eames Studio?
The what studio?
Was it the Eames Studio?
Yes. She was one of the women designers, like the only woman, apart from Roy Eames, but she worked for them for years. She was an incredible innovator, and in fact was asked to come and teach a class when Jean was at the St. Paul School of Art. Jean always felt a bit competitive with Marian, but maybe in person they got along. But with her mother, she would just keep saying, so tell Marian I'm in a show, So she was very aware of her cousin.
Marian was lucky to marry a commercial photographer, and they lived out in Topanga Canyon, all up on the hills of Topanga, on the edge of Los Angeles.
That sounds beautiful. So, yeah. Oh, and Lee Bontaku, somebody, Renee Flanagan, thank you for bringing that up. When Jean was the Costellis, Ileana and Leo Costelli were going to do a retrospective exhibition of Jean's work in 1959 when she decided not to stay with them, and she went to the Green Gallery, where a friend of hers was the director of the Green Gallery. This, to me, in my mind, this fateful decision, because the Costelli Gallery endured while the Green Gallery, of course, did not. But after Jean left, the artist that they brought on to the Costelli Gallery was Lee Bontaku. And in many ways, I mean, as I think of my last chapter, that's an artist I want to look at. And Lee Bontaku's work takes the found object and this idea of a relief and brings it into this very different direction. Less. I would say that it's more confrontational what Lee Bontaku's doing, not in a bad way, but in a really interesting, dynamic way, and a little more dystopian about technology and industrial materials. So I thank you for mentioning that. You're absolutely spot on.
Well, we've been at it for an hour and a half. It's about time to call
Peter,
it a night.
you this from me.
Oh, Melissa, you've given us so much to think about, and there's so much recognition that hopefully Jean is going to get in the years ahead. Thank you, and thank you all for coming. Please do follow the Ramsey County Historical Society, the Eastside Freedom Library. Look at our websites. There will be more History Revealed programs in January and throughout 2022. And stay well and stay in touch. Melissa, thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone. And thank you also to Bob and to Don for also weighing in with their remembrances. It's so meaningful to me and I think for everyone.
Yeah. Yep. Great.
You're welcome.
And I second, this is Robin from the Ramsey County Historical Society. I second our thanks to Melissa and to all of you for coming. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season and stay well, and we'll hope to see you at a program soon. And as a reminder, the video of this will be on both of our YouTube channels in a few days. So we'll need to do a little bit of setup and we'll get that uploaded. So again, thank you all so much. And thank you, Melissa, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank